covering up the lights. I can't find my fifth rock. I have no. He's covering up the lights. I like all of them. They're good. I drink. Sometimes on school days I drink coffee. Do you coffee on school days? They say at midnight, Halloween night, go slow ride through the grave. Yeah, probably do. But that's not the thing, I never believe that.
Oh, you're hiding, huh?
How can I go walk in it like paper? So explain that we were not hiding.
Good evening. My name is Wayne Decker. I'm the Vice President of the Neversink Valley Area Museum, and I'm glad to see such a great crowd here. We've been doing this program, we're not real sure. We think it was about 9 years ago that we first did it. And every year it gets bigger and bigger. We have to add more and more seats outside every year. So we're real glad that it's become such a popular event for everybody. We have our usual group of very talented storytellers. And before we bring them out, I just wanted to say a couple of words. One is that this program was originally started for us by a very good friend of the museum and longtime board member, Elsie Pantley. Elsie was a terrific supporter of the museum and really put this whole storytelling program together those 9 or 10 years ago. In recent years, Dan Cohen has been our master of the tales, and Dan decided to take a year off this year. So you're stuck with me doing the introductions, and I don't claim to do it in nearly the style that Dan can do them. But because Dan has told us that he will be back with us next year, and because Dan isn't with us this year, our first storyteller, Glen Pontier, is going to change his normal presentation and offer us a little something different. So Glen?
You know, it is great. I love coming here, and I'm not sure why. What is it about Halloween? Ghosts, witches, spirits, ballerinas, clowns. I mean, we dress up, and in a strange way, we face some of the worst fears with a sense of humor, with a sense of dignity. Strange people we are, wonderful people. I love it. I tell terrible ghost stories about people cutting people apart and frightening people to death. And I'm essentially, like most of you, a peaceful, peace-loving person. Why do I do this? Why do you all come to hear this? For good reasons. Normally I tell stories, but tonight I'm not going to tell stories. I'm going to read a couple of stories. And these are stories that were written by Dan Cohen in a book called Phone Call from a Ghost. He wrote this last year. It was published in 1988. One of the reasons why I like this book is because it's dedicated to me, a teller of ghostly tales. One of the reasons I'm going to read it tonight is because Dan isn't here, and probably most of you people know why, because his daughter Theo was killed in an airplane crash just around Christmas time, also last year in 1988. It's a tough way to come and celebrate Halloween for him now in the way he usually has. But I want to bring some of his presents to you, and some stories of ghosts, which is really why we're all here. You know, we sometimes think of ghosts as only having been in English castles. You should have seen what I passed on the road driving down here tonight. These are some of the stories from his chapter called Phone Call from a Ghost. Imagine this. The phone rings, you pick it up, and you hear a familiar voice. It's the voice of someone you know, someone who is dead. That's a pretty scary thought, but it has happened. At least there are a lot of people who say it has happened. There have been so many reports of this type that a couple of investigators looked into some of these stories. These people talked to a woman they called Patricia Adams, though that's not her real name. Patricia Adams is a well-known actress who didn't want her real name used. Most people who report experiences of this type don't want the publicity. Patricia Adams told the researchers a story she remembered when she was a little girl. Her mother had a close friend, we will call her Mrs. Jones, who also had a daughter named Barbara. But this girl was much older than Patricia. She had gone away to college, though she always came back home for the holidays. In her third year at college, Barbara was killed in an automobile accident while driving home for the holidays. A few years after the accident, Patricia Adams and her mother were visiting the Jones family at Thanksgiving. After dinner, the children went into one room and the grown-ups went into another. Then the telephone rang. Patricia Adams was nearest to the phone, so she picked it up. It was the long-distance operator. She said she had a collect call for Mrs. Jones. It was from her daughter, Barbara. This threw me a little bit, even as a child, and I said, "Just a minute." I went and got my mother's friend. She came to the phone, and I stood watching her because I had heard the name, and I thought that maybe someone was playing a joke on me or her or something. She listened on the phone, turned absolutely white, and fainted. Later, Patricia found out why Mrs. Jones' reaction was so extreme. The voice that came over the phone sounded exactly like that of her dead daughter. The words she used were familiar as well. "Mommy, it's me. I need $20 to get home." It was a phrase the dead girl often used before she came home. It had almost become a family joke. Her mother always sent the $20. The phone company had no record of the call. These two investigators talked to a young musician named Carl. He also had a strange experience to tell them. While he was growing up, he lived with his grandmother, who was almost completely deaf. When Carl went out and his grandmother was to be alone, he would leave her with a telephone number where she could be reached. If she wanted him, she would dial the number and say, "This is Carl's grandmother. Would you tell him that I need him home?" The grandmother was so deaf that she couldn't hear if anybody answered the phone. So she would just repeat the phrase 5 or 6 times and hang up. "This is Carl's grandmother. Would you tell him that I need him home? This is Carl's grandmother. Would you tell him that I need him home?" Carl's grandmother died when he was 16. 2 years later, he was at the home of a friend of his, Peter. Peter and his family didn't know anything about the old woman's strange way of making calls. Carl and Peter were in the basement practicing some music. The phone rang upstairs, and Peter's mother answered. Then she shouted to the basement, "Carl, there's an old woman on the phone. She says she's your grandmother and she needs you. She just keeps saying it over and over again." Carl rushed up the stairs and grabbed the phone, but the line was dead. There are lots of accounts where the figure of a person who has just died appears suddenly to a relative or a close friend who may be some distance away. Sometimes it seems that the newly dead person just phones. Don Owens of Toledo, Ohio, wrote of his experience to Fate magazine. Owens had a close friend named Lee Epps. Though Epps had long held a good job, he lived alone and was basically a shy and lonely man. He was very attached to Owens and his wife Ethel, whom he called Sis. On the evening of October 28, 1968, the phone rang at the Owens house. Don Owens was out, but his wife picked up the phone. She recognized Epps' voice immediately. He sounded urgent, and the message was upsetting. "Sis, tell Don I'm feeling real bad. Never felt this way before. Tell him to get in touch with me the minute he comes in. It's important, sis." When Don Owens came home, he tried to call his friend. There was no answer. Later that night, he learned that Lee Epps had been in the hospital just a few blocks from where the Owens family lived. He had been in a deep coma. He died at 10:30 p.m., the very time the phone call had come in. Doctors agreed that there was no way that Epps could have regained consciousness and made the phone call before he died. Well, you know, the stories of phone calls go on and on, but I'm going to read a different story. This one is a little longer. This is a story that I read to remember Theo. Ghosts are often said to linger around the place where they died. Sometimes that habit takes a curious twist. Take, for example, the ghosts that are associated with Eastern Airlines Flight 401. On the night of Friday, December 29, 1972, Eastern Airlines Flight 401 from New York to Miami was approaching Miami International Airport. In the cockpit, a warning light alerted the crew that something was wrong with the nose landing gear. The pilot of Flight 401, Captain Bob Loft, radioed the tower at Miami that their landing would be delayed. The plane made a wide circle as the crew tried to correct the problem, and apparently did so. But as Flight 401 came around for a second attempt at a landing, it was much too close to the ground. As a result, the plane crashed into the shallow waters of the Florida Everglades, a few miles from the airport. The crash was witnessed by people on the ground and other planes that were either arriving or departing from the Miami airport. As far as the air traffic controllers at the airport were concerned, Flight 401 had simply disappeared from their radar screens. If there is such a thing as a soft airplane crash, that is what Flight 401 experienced. The crew apparently was aware of what was about to happen and did everything possible to cushion the impact. The plane crashed into shallow water and didn't break up completely. The water also helped douse any fires. Since the crash was well witnessed and close to a major city, help could and did arrive quickly. As a result of this fortunate combination of circumstances, there were survivors of the crash, some 70 of them. But there were more victims than survivors. 101 passenger and crew members died in the crash of Flight 401. Of course, there was an investigation. As usual, it wasn't possible to determine exactly what had happened, since the pilot and others responsible for the operation of the plane had been in the cockpit when the crash occurred and had been killed. The best explanation investigators could come up with was with a combination of faulty equipment and pilot error. Either the nose landing gear had actually failed to lower properly, or a faulty warning light told the crew that it had failed. In any case, they were so distracted trying to correct this error that they had failed to keep track of the plane's altitude. By the time they realized just how close to the ground they were, it was too late. The plane that crashed was an L-1011 jumbo jet, a very popular type of aircraft. There were lots of other L-1011s flying for Eastern and other airlines. Just as there had been human survivors of the crash of Flight 401, large portions of the plane itself survived without serious damage. After the investigations, the parts of L-1011 that had been on Flight 401 and that were still working were used as spare parts for other planes in Eastern's fleet. Just as parts of the wrecked car may be used to repair other cars it's the same with airplanes. In fact, it's even more common with airplanes since parts for them are a lot more expensive. Within a few months after the crash, strange rumors began to circulate among Eastern Airline employees. The ghosts of Captain Bob Loft and flight engineer Don Repo, who had been killed in the crash of Flight 401, were being seen on other Eastern flights. The reports came mainly from an L-1011 with the number 318, a plane almost identical to the one that had crashed in the Everglades in December 1972. Many of those who saw the apparitions had known the dead men before the crash, so were quick to recognize them. The airline employees didn't want to talk publicly about their experiences. They were afraid that people would think that they were crazy and they might lose their jobs. Who wants to fly on an airplane with a crazy crew? The airline didn't want to talk about the rumors either. Who wants to fly on a haunted airplane? But the airplane employees talked to one another, and they told the stories to their friends and relatives. So rumors of the ghosts got around. Eventually, the rumors were heard by a writer named John Fuller. He set out to investigate. At first, people wouldn't talk to him, but eventually they loosened up and they collected some pretty astonishing accounts. On one flight, the flight engineer was going through his routine pre-flight inspection. He saw a man wearing the uniform of an Eastern Airlines flight engineer sitting in his seat. He recognized the man as the now dead Don Repo. The apparition of Repo said something like, "You don't need to worry about the pre-flight, I've already done it." Immediately after that, the figure vanished. One flight was actually canceled after the pilot and two flight attendants encountered the ghost of Captain Loft in the first-class compartment. In another incident, the flight attendant was making a final head count of the passengers. She counted one extra in first class. She figured it was the fellow in the Eastern Airlines uniform. Airplane employees are often able to ride free if seats are available, but they do need a special boarding pass, and most check in. The flight attendant tried to talk to the man, but he stared straight ahead and didn't answer. She called the pilot. He came to look at the silent man and shouted, "My God, it's Bob Luft." Then the figure vanished. During a flight on an L-1011, one of the flight attendants discovered that an oven used for heating meals had an overloaded circuit. A man in an engineer's uniform appeared and fixed the oven. A few minutes later, another engineer showed up, and when he was told that the oven had already been fixed, he insisted that he was the only engineer on the flight. Later, the flight attendant identified a photo of Don Repo as the man who had fixed the oven. These are just a few of the dozens of accounts that Fuller collected in his book, The Ghost of Flight 401. Fuller felt that the majority of the encounters with the ghosts of Captain Loft and Dan Repo had occurred on one particular plane, number 318, because that plane used a large number of the salvaged parts from the crashed plane. Other 1011s on which there had also been sightings of the ghost had also used parts from the downed airliner. Though there were those who saw the figures of Captain Loft or flight engineer Repo were usually quite shaken, the ghosts themselves do not seem to have been at all menacing. In fact, they seem to want to be helpful in a small way, like fixing an oven or making an announcement after fashioning seatbelts. Still, the airline employees wished that they would go away. Even a helpful ghost can be very unsettling. Finally, some of the people who had seen the apparitions felt that they were able to get in touch with the spirit of Don Repo through use of a Ouija board. Eventually, the number of sightings dwindled and faded away. That's the story of Flight 401. There are other stories. How near and how yet so far is Halloween from our own experiences. Thank you very much.
I forgot to tell you, make one important announcement. That is that we will be having intermission after a couple more storytellers. And because we're in pretty tight quarters here and there's a lot of folks outside who are trying to hear, we ask that you keep your seats and wait until the intermission.
What the heck's going on in here?
We got this guy again. The old Canaler.
Oh, God, it must be that time of year again. Well, just went out and buried one of my old friends. You're gonna laugh about that. But you know, when I was young, there used to be some undertakers down in Port Jervis. Their names, I probably shouldn't say them, but it was Chevrolet and Hunt. Now these boys had a pretty good, thriving business. You see, in the front was the undertaker parlor, and in the back there was a distillery. I haven't drank some of the stuff they made. I often wondered if they weren't trying to get patrons faster for the front. But they were evil. I'm not talking little evil, I'm talking big evil. Seems like, I don't know if you people remember this because you're probably all too young. But when somebody died, you didn't have to read the morning paper. What you did was go past the undertaking parlor, and they'd have them sitting there in a coffin, just like this, packed in ice. So you'd know if your neighbor died or a loved one or something. Oh, I remember him. And that's the way it went. Maybe a day later they took him up here to Westbrookville or down there in Port Jervis, and they buried him. Well, they decided that they weren't making enough money just burying people. So they got a hold of a real great idea. See, up here when you buried people, you made your own pine coffins. Or you made them out of oak. You put the body in there in a sack and took them out there to the field and dug the ditch and lowered them down and buried them up. Well, Chevrolet and Hunt decided maybe they'd bring some class to Port Jervis. And what they did, they went down there to that New York City. They got themselves one fancy coffin. Well, I'm talking a nice big mahogany coffin. It had silver handles on it. It even had a lid that opened up. You didn't have to nail it down. They was smart. They also had a little attachment put on it. What it was, every time they took the dearly beloved out to bury him, they'd lay him on those ropes like that. After the minister came, the people were there. They'd pull this little lever. The body just dropped into the grave. Everybody thought they were going to lower the coffin down there, but they never did. They waited till everybody left and they put it back into that hearse. Well, that was good. Then they started to get greedy. They heard of this medical college that opened up over there in Honesdale. Then they decided, why not drop the dearly beloved into the hole. We'll wait 20 minutes till everybody leaves. Then we grab the body if it's a good specimen, and we'll send it over there for them to carve up that cadaver and use them for experiments. was a nice guy. He was a Swede. He come over from Sweden. He had two bad problems, I guess you could call it. One was he liked cats. And he had a cat. And I'm telling you, this was the biggest cat you ever saw. It was a panther, and you can check the papers. There used to be a lot of panthers that lived around here before we got civilized. Big black panther, and he called it Grouch. Well, this damn thing would knock him back and forth in his rooming house there every night. Scratch him up on the back, scratch him on the face. But old Eric didn't seem to mind it, so nobody in Port Jervis minded it either. Well, Eric's second fault was he had fits. And these fits would come on him. He'd start shaking and wobbling, and his tongue would roll back, and his eyes would roll back. And sometimes you'd think he was just dead as a stone. But luckily, we had a doctor down there in Port that used to come out and check him out, and he'd say, no, don't worry, it's just one of his fits. Well, sure enough, one day, poor old Eric had a fit. He was rolling around and kicking, and then he just went stone, just like that. Well, the doctor was out of town. We didn't know what to do. So we called the next best thing. It was old Doc Simpson there, the veterinarian. He come over and he looked at him and says, well, boys, pull his tongue out. There, it's coated. All right, now take his shoes off. We'll look at his feet. Oh, they're mottled. Well, let's thump him in the chest a few times. Bam, bam. Sorry, boys. Afraid old Eric's passed on. Immediately, they got a hold of old Chevry and Hunt. They come riding up in their big hearse. 4 black horses and that great big carriage. Grabbed the body, threw it in the back. Well, Eric didn't have much family. They had a lot of friends. Friends got together and they decided, why not get him one of them fancy coffins that these people use? Why not? So they all chipped in. Sure enough, they put him in that fancy coffin and they set him in that window and packed him in ice. He was laying there, smile on his face. Well, funeral come next day. They load him in that hearse and goes. Well, I gotta tell you about Hunt. Hunt's about 6'2", 6'4", a real shallow face, big black hat and black coat, and his eyes, they burned. They were all red. I don't know if it was from the stuff they made in the back or what it was, but he cried like that. But Chevry, he was a nice little man. He was about that tall and balding and had a nice little fat face. But you could tell he was evil because every time he opened his mouth, all his teeth were pointed. He'd smile at you like this and say, "Oh, how are you doing?" Like he was looking for the next customer. Well, these two got that hearse up here and they got to the cemetery. They laid out the sawhorses and the ropes. Put that big fancy coffin on there. Stood there and smiling like that. All the friends were there and the parson came up. He said the words over them just as they were going to lower the body down. Hunt says, we would rather do this without the sight of friends. So all of the friends got back in their carriages and on their horses and they went back to Port Jervis. Chevry turns to Hunt and he says, well, what do you think the body's worth? You think we can sell that? So he was debilitated. He was yellow. I don't know. I wouldn't want them people over there in that medical school getting a bad body and getting sick, and then they wouldn't buy another body from us. So, yeah, I guess you're right. He says, well, let's just drop it and bury it as fast as we can. So what they did, they put that over there and they pulled that thing and boom, down went that sack with old Eric in it. And then they got the shovel and they were throwing the dirt on as fast as they could. They didn't do too good of a job, though. They were just trying to get out of there. Took the coffin, threw it in the back of the hearse, soon as he saw the people go, he'd come running down there to save his friend. And he dug and dug and dug and dug. Sure enough, he hit that sack, he caught poor Eric in the head and ripped some of the skin off it. But by God, he pulled him out of there. Well, Eric gets out of that bag, and he's walking down what you call 209, I guess now. Stark naked. Doesn't know where he is. With a panther. Well, it's darker, darker. They used to have gas lights down there in Fort Jervis, and they lit the lights, and the constabulary was walking around with their billy clubs looking for evildoers. Here comes old Eric down the street, naked as a jaybird, with that big panther with him. Now, nobody wants to mess with that panther because they know he's going to tear him apart. Well, finally, somebody went over, and we had a high sheriff down there. Just a district, Sullivan County was where the main jail was. He went over and he told the high sheriff, and he says, well, I thought he died. I saw him laid out. He says, oh, no, he's walking down the street, nude as a jaybird, and he's got that cat with him. He said, are you sure he's alive and he's not dead, is he? Because I don't want to go out on a false pretense here. He said, no, I think he's alive. He went out. He walked up to him and he touched him. And sure enough, he was alive. Well, he told the sheriff what he could remember of what happened. Sure enough, they went over there to old Chevery and Hunt, arrested him, sent him up to the jail. Well, old Eric's still around. Any of you people ever run into him, he usually hangs down there by Homer's restaurant. You'll notice him by the scratches on the top of his head and his back. And give him a little milk and a pat in the head, and he'll be happy. Oh, I want to make a public service announcement here too. Anybody that wants to borrow my shovel after this is over, especially if you have somebody buried